So now it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Jeremy Grantham. Unfortunately, it also falls to me to share some very unfortunate news that Mr. Grantham has been fighting a bad cold, which late last week developed into bronchitis, and there was no way that he could travel to be with us here in person today, unfortunately. He was as disappointed as we are to not have him here in person, but he very graciously has offered to call in and share his presentation and his comments with us, which we really appreciate, and I think which really underscores how important he sees this meeting and this audience as we look at the climate crisis. So Mr. Grantham's full bio is in your program, but he is one of the founders of the Boston-based investment firm GMO. He's an extremely well-respected investor, and for years his newsletters and market commentaries have been followed closely and widely by investors and others around the world. And these commentaries for many years have included clear-eyed analysis on what we would call sustainability challenges, from resource shortages to the impacts of climate change. Through their foundation, he and his wife have supported research, communication, and action on addressing the climate crisis. And he recently announced that he will put 98% of his net worth towards advancing climate solutions. We couldn't be more appreciative for Mr. Grantham's leadership on this issue, or more pleased that he has agreed to share his insights and analysis with us today despite his illness. So please join me in crossing my fingers that the technology works smoothly and welcoming by phone Jeremy Grantham.
Hi. I'm so sorry not to be there in person. I've learned the hard way in recent years if a cold gets on your chest, you should take evasive action and not travel around. I've only had pneumonia twice in my life, but it was twice in the last 6 years. On the other hand, I was really keen to appear, so I pushed for this talk. I hope it's not too inconvenient. It's such an important issue to me, and I know it's not that important to you. And in terms of the general public and my general clients, they don't register these issues as I do. The Grantham Foundation has substantially all my capital in or committed. I don't really view it as philanthropy, but as a necessary defensive action for my children, grandchildren, and their descendants. They used to say grandchildren, but now it's clearly the children. Every few weeks, we have the luxury at the Grantham Foundation. We answer to nobody to reassess what we're trying to do. And the issues really come down to, can we help encourage a sustainable, stable environment? You obviously can't have that with the climate changing. You can't have that with the burning of fossil fuels. You can't have that with population continuing to grow indefinitely, and you certainly can't have increasing and steady waste, deforestation, or the current style of agriculture, especially this excuse me, heavy use of chemicals. We are in short way over the sustainable carrying capacity of our planet, and our challenge is, can we buy time for an orderly decline in the population over the next 8 or 10 generations, perhaps to a level of 2 or 3 or 4 billion. The amazing thing to me is how little the average person appears to care about these existential threats, and they really are existential threats. It's inexplicable. In the case of the climate awareness, though, 2018 was a breakthrough year. New administration, new president had something to do with that. The scientists felt they were being attacked and spoke with a clearer voice. And last year in particular, we had a coincidence of important peer-reviewed papers in top journals and reports from agencies. The IPCC 1.5 degree paper NASA and the other government agencies reporting in a particularly to the point way in both cases. And they were backed up by absolutely critical papers in Nature and Science and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. One of them, nicknamed Hothouse Earth, outlined clearly what could become self-reinforcing vicious cycles. And some of them might even start at 1.5 degrees. There's no guarantee that we are not passing as we speak some of these irreversible points, but they outlined what might reasonably be expected to be at risk at 2 degrees, 3 degrees, and 4 degrees, by which time even the eastern Antarctic would go, which is 60 feet of ocean increase. So that seemed to get the job done, and in the last 3 years, the percentage of people aware that the climate is changing has advanced from 63 to 74%, and last year from 71 to 74. And that's a critical number. If you're in the denial business, you begin to worry that 26% is not a stable market on which to build a political power. And certainly from 74 to 84, it's game over. So the denialist part of our political system is reassessing its position on climate change as we speak. The reason that all of these papers were so effective last year was because they took place against a background of these deadly fires in California that started early in the spring and went right through into the fall. It's sad that it would take that, but it appears to need it. But on other fronts, we have total unawareness, my favorite being toxicity. 2 years ago, famous German report that on insect loss that got written up on the cover of New York Times 2 years later, but brilliantly written up, I might add. A 75% loss in 62 German forest preserves, not outside refineries. All flying insects had gone missing to the tune of 75%. And then following up 3 months ago now, a Puerto Rican study, which in the protected tropical forest, protected by the King of Spain, there had also been an approximately similar loss of flying insects, and in fact, all insects. Everyone agrees that the loss of insects could have terrible implications, and particularly for flowering plants that need pollination, but no one can actually spit it out. We spent 4 hours with one of the leading insect authorities, and although they know it's terrible, they can't give me a simple example that I could use to popularize the danger. We simply have a lack of people studying insects other than a couple of famous monarch butterflies and commercially important honeybees, and yet it seems to be across the board. And there is a cascade effect expected that will have, let's say, unknown and potentially horrific consequences. But more important and more impressive that we ignore it is the similar reduction in human sperm count in the developed world, where we have a lot of studies. A meta-study of 200 reports concludes that we've lost 50% in 50 years, 60 perhaps from the peak. We're declining at 1% a year, and, quote, there is no sign at all of any stopping. To which I say to my financial audience, okay, so 50% decline in 50 years doesn't get your attention. How about 100% in 100 years? I mean, it's available information, and it's utterly ignored, and it has dramatic implications, one of which is that for the fertility rate in the developed world is actually dropping all the time. The U.S. just had the co-equal lowest to 1 year in the Great Depression, 1.76%, 15% below the 2.1 required for a stable population. The general thinking is that this is exposure to chemicals of all kinds, the insects particularly to pesticides, but pesticides also seep into our environment, and of course plastics everywhere. And endocrine disruptors pass through generations and accumulate on the way, so that your children in the womb are damaged. They're continued in their lifetime to be exposed, and their children, etc. And pretty soon you can see what happens. The study in the last 6 weeks, building on the Puerto Rican study, grabbed one of the tropical beetles, which has a month life cycle, so they could study it quickly. They exposed it to a heat wave. 5 days of 5 degrees centigrade above normal. Tropical creatures are not used to much of a change in temperature. And it reduced their sperm count by 50%. And after 2-week rest, they gave them another heat wave, and they were totally sterile. So these are indeed scary times, and no one yet has caught up with the implications. The data here in my exhibits is 18 months old, normally would be fine, but there's been a surge of new data, both on the good side and the bad side. On the good side, I have 4 helpers all spending time on new technologies, where we try and help at the very early stages and try and get a economic participation for the foundation should any of them become good, one of which has. We're happily an investor in the leading edge of solid-state lithium-ion, half the weight, half the volume, charges in 10 minutes, and will change automobiles, telephones, and so on. When and if it successfully comes to market. It's been presented to a leading automobile company who's invested $350 million in it. So hoping this will make up for some of the early, less profitable investments that we made along the way. I'm sure we'll have plenty of green energy eventually, and I'm sure we'll completely decarbonize. The technologies are everywhere and impressive and moving much faster than any environmentalist seems to realize. The bad news is they're not moving fast enough, and by the time we've decarbonized, the question will be, what are the implications then and in the future of that level of damage? I wanted to start with Exhibit 22, just to make sure we covered it. Yes, you can divest from oil. This is something I should have done 30 years ago. We looked at the market and we took out each of 10 major groups, including energy, the utilities, and so on. And we said, how would it be if you'd invested since '89?
This free conference call is provided by Uber Conference.
Avoid plus or minus. Are you okay there? How much would an investor pay to avoid plus or minus 25 basis points? Probably 5 or 10 bips is all it would cost. So that is the real cost of ethics. And moving through the standard exhibits, Exhibit 4, start the ball rolling. All of these are available at gmo.com in a proper paper, Race of Our Lives Revisited, with a complete narrative. I really urge you to look at it. What I'll do here, though, is update with anything that seems to have changed. Exhibit 4 is the old Al Gore exhibit that shows the incredible sensitivity of our system to a few parts per million of carbon dioxide. Just 180 to 280 parts per million has separated the so-called ice ages at the bottom, of which we've had 4, from the interglacials, of which this is the 5th. And if we had no carbon dioxide at all, we'd be a frozen ball at minus 25 degrees centigrade. And just the addition of those 280 parts per million have taken us into the very pleasant world that we've had for the last 15,000 years, which has allowed for the development of civilization. That takes us to 1950 approximately at the top, equal to other interglacials. And then hopefully you can click the next one and see it basically double in no time at all, where we're now up to 400 parts per million. What an exciting experiment this is. We have doubled the amount that separates ice ages from interglacials, and we will triple it. I give you my personal guarantee before this is over. It is the most feckless experiment, obviously, in the history of man. In terms of the damage, it's accelerating. Scientists had a hard time saying this on Exhibit 5. The first half of the last century, the temperature increased a fairly modest 7 bips per year, 0.007 degrees centigrade per year. In the second half by 15, and between the last 2 El Niños, at 25. This is acceleration, and they would not say it. I've been happily using that exhibit for 5 years, but starting in the Trump era, the scientists have begun to spit out the word acceleration increasingly. I got a paper in Nature, a commentary, amazingly. It was called Be Persuasive, Be Brave, Be Arrested if Necessary, and it was hammering away at the timidity then of the climate scientists. I would not write it today. I think they're saying what they honestly believe, and they're making it accessible to ordinary humans. Page 6 shows the Met Office's version of this in Technicolor. Red and deep red is above average temperature, deep blue is below, and you can see how nonsensical the idea of pauses or anything else is in this more or less steady move from dark blue to dark red. Page 7 covers the same thing in the ocean. The black line is 2,000 meters, and it shows enormous acceleration on the right. From 1950 to 1990, 37 heat units increment a year, and in the last 26 years, 99 units, nearly 3 times the rate. If that doesn't scare you, it scares me. And what we have discovered recently is that the heat has been, the ocean has been absorbing heat at 40% greater rate than was previously thought. This was in a report from Nature, which famously made a mistake on the first iteration, but it corrected it, and it's 40% increase. That's 40% increase in the entire sensitivity of the global system to carbon dioxide. Oceans absorb 97% of all the heat, and they have been absorbing 40% more than we were aware of. And there it is in the system. And if the oceans decide that they've had enough and leave more for the 3% that goes on into the soil and the atmosphere, you can imagine what chaos that would bring. Exhibit 8 is an accurate portrayal of a 60-year move in the Muir Glacier. Exhibit 9 is a typical look at one of the more dependable features of our bad news, and that's an increase in downpours, whether it's 3 inches a day or 4 inches, 5 inches, they all look the same. Exhibit 10 is just a quick run through of some of the ugly accelerating data from floods, drought, mortality, extreme temperature events, and wildfires, which do not sadly include either Houston with 10 inches a day, over 10 inches a day for 3 consecutive days, or the terrible wildfires last year. But the good news is what a rapid rate of improvement in technology. Exhibit 11 shows the price of the typical coal plant and how just 10 years ago, utility scale solar was a joke, as was wind, and how dramatically they have come down and will continue to decline. They will decarbonize the system. Storage is a big problem, but the technology is there. Almost everyone with a brain seems to be working on that one. Exhibit 12 gives you some idea of what goes on in the wind business. When you're cycling in Holland, you're going past the 2 megawatt turbines on the right, and they are big. But now you can buy off the shelf for 2022 delivery from GE a 260 meter high 12 megawatt turbine. And the power goes up by the square of the blade, pi r squared. So a 20-foot blade is 4 times the power of a 10-foot blade. And as you go up, you pick up some more wind, and the power from wind goes up by the cube. 140 mile an hour hurricane is not 17% more dangerous than a 120 mile an hour hurricane. It's almost 50% more. You have to cube 14 versus cubing 12. And as we build bigger and bigger ones, they become more efficient. And now the question is, can we site them in the deep ocean where the wind blows up to 80% of the time in the North Atlantic and 60% plus in the North Sea? And can we build them bigger on land where at the moment only a 62 meter long blade can be moved by train or by road? Grantham Foundation is looking at the idea of building a very long, relatively lightweight plane designed to just carry 75, 80 meter blades to a wind farm inland. That completely changes the game. Battery's always been considered the big disappointment, and page 13 shows for a disappointment how amazing it has been. In 2010, Tesla wanted $1,000 for a megabyte, and this year, last year, 2018, they reckon they got it down actually to 150, and in 2025, their target on the regular existing battery will be about 80, and if they can introduce our solid state or competing solid state, it is likely at scale to be half that. Even 80 is below the price, the cost of an internal combustion engine. So they will all go, and it will apply to vans and trucks, and eventually will help in shipping and even in planes, as we'll get to. The bad news is with all of these amazing developments, we still are looking at a world where in 2050, half of it will be fossil fuels. This is based on really quite aggressive renewables and so on. And so the oil companies are, in that sense, half correct. And what that means on page 15 is that although fossil fuel use may optimistically peak in the next 5 years, carbon emissions will continue to rise for a considerable time, and with enormous consequences. On page 16, those are the consequences as we can best work them out. By 2050, we will hit the deadly 2 degrees centigrade, which means that nothing really is secure, and then we will be scratching and biting and struggling with politicians and everybody else to stay under 3 degrees centigrade. My best guess is we will do a lot better as we have more fires and more proof and more damage, but we will not do anything materially better than 3 degrees centigrade, which means we have to learn to live in a considerably different world. Now, the costs of doing this on page 17 are a very minimum of trillions of dollars, although this is an odd accounting. because if you don't do it, you're still going to be spending trillions of dollars in the old carbon world, and you will be spending very quickly hundreds of billions in the new world of damage from climate change effects. So this is not an incremental cost. There is a negative incremental cost. It will be over 20, 30, 40, 50 years, it will simply be cheaper to run and spend on greening the system than paying the price of staying our ground. Slide 18, or a picture, is something we're investing in the Boston area, an ultra lightweight vehicle, probably 600 or 700 pounds, a three-seater with a less drag than any vehicle on the road, including a motorbike, fully electric, of course, and goes like a rocket ship. Read it and weep, Mr. Musk, and cheap to produce. But it will only take one or two people and is really designed for emerging markets. The next exhibit is a plane. It's actually almost ready to go. Carries 9 passengers and 2 pilots, ultra lightweight. The trouble here is that 60% of its entire weight is its battery. You can imagine how amazingly significant it will be to get a battery that is half the weight. And suddenly, instead of 9 passengers, you'll have 17. And instead of flying 600 miles, you'll be able to travel 1,000 miles. And finally, my new Tesla arrived in November. It also goes like a rocket ship. But you could say that it's the last of the old-fashioned cars, and I do think the future will be more along the lines that I showed you. I have 2 minutes on my clock, so I'm just going to tell you one or two other interesting things that we've done. We have, in a local firm, found someone who has been able to extract RNA. RNA is the kind of engineer that instructs DNA what to do. The trouble is, for research, it's invaluable, but it was $1,000 a gram. And in the space of a few months, with a dazzling breakthrough, he has reduced the cost from $1,000 a gram to 35 cents. That is known as disruptive. The target for the end of this year is 10 cents. And suddenly it's available for masses of research. And just to make that point finally, they decided to use it for turning off a particular part of the DNA in the infamous Colorado potato beetle. And it doesn't affect any other beetle, even close cousins. The Colorado beetle is simply unable to digest cellulosic fiber, so it cheerfully eats the plant and drops dead with starvation. 1 gram, 10 gallons for 1 acre. Those potentials seem to me bizarrely almost everywhere we go now, with great implications for toxicity, for farming, and for climate change, if only we had enough time. Thank you.